Hello everyone. Welcome to today's history program. When we think of major cities in the Middle East, we might think of Dubai's skyscrapers, Cairo's pyramids, or Istanbul's mosques. But there's one city whose story is equally fascinating, yet often overlooked. This is Tehran, the capital of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Today's Tehran is a modern metropolis with a population of 9 million, one of the largest cities in the Middle East. It is a political center, an economic hub, and a cultural sanctuary. But few people know that this now prosperous city was merely a small village hidden in a valley on the Persian plateau 800 years ago. Tehran's history is like an epic full of ups and downs. It witnessed the iron hooves of the Mongols, experienced the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, observed the invasion of Western powers, endured the flames of revolution, and survived the trauma of war. After each destruction, it rose again. In each moment of despair, it found hope. In the time ahead, I will take you through time, from 330 BCE, when Greek armies swept across the Persian Empire, to the signing of the nuclear agreement in 2015. We will see how a small village grew into a great city, how a marginal town became a national capital, and how a traditional city struggled, transformed, and was reborn in the tide of modernization. This is not only the story of a city, but also a microcosm of a nation and a witness to a civilization. Now, let us return to the past, to that moment that changed Tehran's destiny. Chapter 1. Dawn of Civilization. From prehistory to the Persian Empire. In the north-central part of the Iranian plateau, at the southern foothills of the Alborz Mountains, lies an ancient land. This is where today's Tehran is located. As early as 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period, there were already traces of human activity on this land. Archaeological excavations show that around 6000 BCE, the primitive inhabitants of the Tehran region began transitioning from nomadic life to settled agriculture. They established villages in the valleys, cultivated wheat and barley, and domesticated goats and sheep. These early farmers used streams formed by mountain snowmelt to irrigate their fields, creating the earliest agricultural civilization on the Persian plateau. Pottery, stone tools, and simple copper implements witnessed the dawn of civilization on this land. However, what truly made the Persian plateau shake the world was a historical moment in 550 BCE. A Persian prince named Cyrus overthrew the rule of the Median kingdom and established the Achaemenid dynasty. This is the famous Persian Empire in history. Cyrus the Great was an outstanding conqueror and ruler. His empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, becoming the largest empire in the world at that time. Although the Tehran region was not the center of the empire at that time, the capitals were Persepolis and Susa. This land, as an important area in the northern part of the empire, connecting the Caspian coast with the empire's heartland, became increasingly strategically important. The Persian Empire was renowned not only for its military conquests, but also for its advanced administrative system and religious tolerance policies. Cyrus the Great allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own religions and customs, which was extremely rare in the ancient world. The empire practiced Zoroastrianism, an ancient religion that worshipped fire and light, whose concept of dualism of good and evil profoundly influenced later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, the empire's glory was not eternal. In 330 BCE, a young Macedonian king named Alexander led Greek armies to sweep across the Persian Empire. In the Battle of Gaugamela, the last Persian king Darius III was defeated and fled, and the Achaemenid dynasty collapsed. Alexander burned the palace of Persepolis, symbolizing the end of an era. Alexander's conquest brought about the fusion of Greek and Persian cultures. Although this conqueror died young, at only 33 years old, the Hellenistic era had already begun. The Tehran region became a frontier of cultural exchange between East and West during this period, with Greek philosophy and art beginning to penetrate Persian traditions. In 247 BCE, the Parthians established a new Persian dynasty, resisting the eastward expansion of the Roman Empire. In 224 CE, the Sasanian dynasty replaced it, once again reviving Persian glory. The Sasanian dynasty ruled for nearly 400 years, making Zoroastrianism the state religion and creating a brilliant Persian culture. The Tehran region gradually developed during this period, becoming an important passage connecting the eastern and western parts of the empire. However, no one could have predicted that a storm from the Arabian Peninsula was about to completely change the fate of this land. Chapter 2: Silk Road and Faith, Commercial, Prosperity, and Islamization. During the centuries of Sasanian rule, a trade route that would change the world was forming. This was the ancient Silk Road. From the 2nd century BCE, Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were transported westward by Central Asian caravans, while Roman glassware, gold and silver vessels, and wine flowed eastward into Persia and China. Although the Tehran region was not on the main artery of the Silk Road, as a hub connecting the southern Caspian coast with the Persian heartland, it gradually developed into an important commercial transit point. The caravans brought not only goods, but also ideas, religions, and cultures. Buddhist monks, Nestorian missionaries, and Manichaean believers all left their footprints on this land. Villages and towns in the Tehran region began to prosper, with post stations, inns, and markets emerging. Persian merchants were known for their shrewdness and integrity, and their commercial networks spanned the Eurasian continent. However, in the early 7th century, the long war between the Sasanian dynasty and the Byzantine Empire exhausted the empire's strength. Just as the empire weakened, a new force rose in the Arabian Peninsula. In 622 CE, the Prophet Muhammad established an Islamic regime in Medina. After his death, the succeeding caliphs launched large-scale wars of conquest. In 637 CE, Arab armies defeated the Sasanian army at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. In 642 CE, they completely destroyed Persian resistance at the Battle of Nihavand. In 651 CE, the last Sasanian king Yazdegerd III was killed while fleeing, and the 400-year Sasanian dynasty perished. Arab cavalry flooded into the Persian plateau like a tide. Zoroastrian temples in the Tehran region were converted into mosques, and Persian nobles either converted to Islam or paid heavy taxes. However, the Persians did not completely submit. They transformed Islamic civilization in their own way. The Persian language did not disappear. Instead, it became an important cultural language in the Islamic world. Persian administrative systems, artistic styles, and literary traditions profoundly influenced the Arab Caliphate. Many Persian scholars became scientists, philosophers, and poets of the Islamic Golden Age. The physician Avicenna, the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, and the poets Ferdowsi and Rumi were all outstanding representatives of Persian Islamic civilization. From the 8th to the 13th century was the golden age of Islamic civilization. Although the Tehran region was still a relatively minor town, it had fully integrated into the Islamic world. The inhabitants here spoke Persian, practiced Islam, but retained ancient Persian traditional festivals. Nowruz, Persian New Year, remains Iran's most important festival to this day. The Silk Road continued to prosper, with caravans coming and going. Post stations in the Tehran region received merchants from China, India, Central Asia, and Arabia. People of different faiths traded and communicated here, creating a diverse and prosperous era. However, in the early 13th century, an unprecedented disaster was about to descend. Mongol cavalry was coming from the east, and their conquest would turn this prosperous land into ruins. Tehran's history was about to turn its darkest page. Chapter 3: Refuge under Mongol iron hooves. In 1220 CE, a catastrophe befell Persia. Genghis Khan's Mongol army swept through Central Asia, with their military might pointing directly at the Persian plateau. Wherever the Mongol cavalry went, cities turned to ruins and civilization was destroyed. In this catastrophe, an ancient city suffered total annihilation to the city of Ray. Ray was located about 10 kilometers south of today's Tehran and was an important node on the Silk Road. This city had a population of hundreds of thousands, prosperous commerce, flourishing culture, and was one of the important centers of Persian civilization. But when the Mongol army approached the city, Ray chose to resist. The price of resistance was devastating. After the Mongols breached the city, they carried out a brutal massacre. The entire city was razed to the ground, hundreds of thousands of residents were killed, buildings were burned, and wealth was plundered. Ray, this city that had been glorious for hundreds of years, disappeared from the map in just a few days. But some people always escape with their lives. Survivors fled south and found a small village at the foothills of the Alborz Mountains, Tehran. This village was far from the main roads, hidden in a valley, and the Mongols did not notice it. For those refugees who had lost their homes, this was a life-saving refuge. The origin of the name Tehran is still disputed. One theory suggests it comes from the Persian Tachin, meaning at the foot of the mountain, describing its geographical location. Another theory suggests it derives from Tehran, meaning warm place, referring to its relatively mild climate. Whichever explanation, the name hints at Tehran's characteristics, a place nestled against mountains with water nearby, mild climate, and suitable for habitation. The refugees from Ray brought technology, culture, and commercial networks, and Tehran began to slowly develop. But for the next few centuries, it remained an inconspicuous small town. From the 13th to 16th centuries, Persia experienced a turbulent period. After the Mongols came the Timurid Empire. After Timur came Turkmen tribes. Political centers constantly shifted, and warfare was frequent. Tehran, far from the center of power, was able to develop peacefully because of this. The inhabitants here mainly lived by agriculture, growing wheat and barley and cultivating orchards. Tehran's pomegranates and cherries were famous in the surrounding areas. Occasionally, caravans traveling between Tehran and the Caspian Sea would stop here, bringing news from the outside world. But overall, Tehran was a peaceful agricultural town. In the 16th century, the Safavid dynasty unified Persia and made Isfahan the capital. That was the golden age of Persian history. Isfahan was built into a magnificent city. Naksh-e-Jahan Square was one of the largest squares in the world. The Seo-se-pol Bridge spanned the Zayandeh River, and the Ali Kapu Palace was resplendent. European travelers came to Isfahan and marveled at its beauty, calling it half the world. In comparison, Tehran was insignificant. It was just a post station on the trade route to the Caspian Sea, a place for caravans to rest. No one would have thought that this small town would one day replace Isfahan and become the capital of Persia. But Tehran had a unique advantage, its geographical location. North of the Alborz Mountains, the highest peak, Mount Damavand, reaches 5,610 meters above sea level, with year-round snow, serving as a natural barrier. South, overlooking the vast plains with an open view, convenient for controlling surrounding areas. Mild climate, not too cold in winter, not too hot in summer. Abundant water sources, with mountain snowmelt forming streams that irrigate farmland. These advantages would play a key role in the 18th century. In the mid-18th century, the Safavid dynasty declined and Persia fell into civil war. Warlords from various regions carved out territories and fought for power. In this chaos, a Turkmen tribal leader from Mazandaran province rose, Aga Muhammad Khan. He was a determined and ruthless military leader. After 30 years of warfare, he defeated his opponents one by one and unified Persia. In 1786, Aga Muhammad Khan made a history-changing decision. He declared Tehran the new capital of Persia. This decision shocked everyone. Why abandon Isfahan and Shiraz, these ancient and prosperous cities, and choose a remote small town? Aga Muhammad Khan had his considerations. First, Tehran was close to his power base in Mazandaran province, convenient for controlling the army. Second, it was located in the center of Persia, convenient for ruling the whole country. Third, and most importantly, Tehran was a blank slate, without the power of old nobility, without complex political networks, and he could shape this city according to his own will. From 1786 onwards, Tehran's destiny completely changed. Chapter 4. Becoming the capital from small town to metropolis. In 1786, when Aga Muhammad Khan declared Tehran the capital, the small town had a population of only about 15,000. It had no magnificent palaces, no solid city walls, not even a decent bazaar. everything had to start from scratch. Aga Muhammad Khan immediately began construction. First were the city walls. A capital must have fortifications. Workers built city walls about 6 kilometers in circumference using mud bricks, opening 12 city gates. The walls were not high and not strong enough, but at least it looked like a capital. Next was the palace. Aga Muhammad Khan built the Golestan Palace, which would become the power center of the Qajar dynasty. The palace adopted traditional Persian architectural style, with exquisite tile decorations, mirror halls, and gardens. Although it couldn't compare with Isfahan's palaces, it was decent enough. With the palace came the need for officials, soldiers, and servants. With these people came the need for merchants, craftsmen, and service personnel. Tehran began to attract population from all over the country. The bazaar gradually formed, with shops opening one after another. Mosques, public baths, and post stations were built successively. By the early 19th century, Tehran's population had exceeded 100,000. It was no longer a small town, but a real city. But becoming the capital also meant becoming the focus of attention, especially from foreign powers. In the 19th century, Persia faced unprecedented external pressure. The Russian Empire to the north was constantly expanding, and the British Empire to the south controlled India. The two empires viewed Persia as the chessboard for their great game. Tehran, as the capital, became the center of this geopolitical rivalry. From 1804 to 1828, Persia fought 2 wars with Russia. The Persian army was poorly equipped and poorly trained, no match for Russia. Both wars ended in Persia's crushing defeat. According to the Treaty of Gulistan and the Treaty of Turkmenchay, Persia lost large territories in the Caucasus region, including today's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. More humiliating was that these treaties also granted Russia extraterritorial rights and economic privileges in Persia. Meanwhile, Britain infiltrated from the south. Britain controlled trade in the Persian Gulf, supported local tribes, and interfered in Persian internal affairs. By the late 19th century, Persia had effectively become a semi-colony of Britain and Russia. Western influence penetrated every corner of Tehran. In 1858, the first telegraph line connected Tehran with Europe, allowing the Persian king to receive messages from London or St. Petersburg within hours. In the 1870s, the first modern bank opened in Tehran, introducing the Western financial system. In the 1890s, the first modern school was established, teaching mathematics, science, and foreign languages, not just traditional religious courses. These changes sparked heated debates among Tehran's elite. Some believed that Persia must learn from the West and carry out modernization reforms, or it would be abandoned by the times. Others believed that Westernization meant losing Persian traditions and Islamic values, and was a dangerous path. This tension erupted in 1890. That year, a British merchant obtained a monopoly on Persia's tobacco trade. This meant that tobacco grown and tobacco products produced by Persians all had to be sold through this British company. Persians were outraged. Tehran's bazaar merchants were the first to act. They closed their shops and refused to sell tobacco. Religious scholars issued fatwas declaring that using tobacco was illegal until the monopoly was cancelled. Ordinary people responded to the call and stopped smoking. This movement quickly spread nationwide. Faced with such large-scale protests, the government was forced to back down and cancel the tobacco monopoly. This was the first time in Persian history that the people forced the government to change policy through collective action. This victory gave people confidence. If they united, they could fight against unjust power. This confidence would erupt again 15 years later on a larger scale with deeper impact. That was the constitutional revolution of 1906. In 1905, revolution broke out in Russia, and the Tsar was forced to agree to establish a parliament. This news reached Tehran and inspired Persian reformers. If Russia could have a parliament, why couldn't Persia? In 1906, large-scale demonstrations broke out in Tehran. The cause was the government's arrest of 2 merchants, which triggered a strike by bazaar merchants. Thousands of people gathered outside the British embassy, seeking refuge according to the custom. At that time, foreign embassies were sanctuaries where the government could not enter to arrest people. The demonstrators made clear demands: establish a parliament, draft a constitution, and limit the king's power. Under popular pressure, the elderly King Mozaffar ad-Din Shah was forced to agree. In October 1906, Persia's first parliament was established in Tehran. In December, the constitution was passed. This was the first large-scale democratic movement in the Middle East, and Tehran became the center of this movement. But the fruits of the revolution were soon threatened. In 1907, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah died, and his son Muhammad Ali Shah succeeded to the throne. The new king was an absolutist who hated the parliament for limiting his power. In June 1908, with Russian support, the king sent troops to bombard the parliament building, arrested parliamentarians, and restored autocratic rule. But the revolutionaries did not give up. In 1909, revolutionary armies from Tabriz and Isfahan marched on Tehran, overthrew Muhammad Ali Shah, and restored the parliament. However, the constitutional revolution ultimately failed to achieve its goals. In 1911, Russia and Britain intervened again, forcing the dissolution of parliament. Persia fell into chaos, with warlords carving out territories. During World War I, although Persia declared neutrality, it actually became a battlefield for armies from various countries. Tehran was occupied multiple times, and people lived in fear and poverty. Just when Persia faced the danger of division, a military man stepped forward, Reza Khan. Chapter 5. Radical Modernization. Reza Khan's Iron Fist. Reza Khan came from humble origins. He was born in 1878, and his father was an ordinary soldier. Reza joined the army from a young age and rose through the ranks through bravery and ability. By 1920, he was the commander of the Cossack Brigade, Persia's most elite military force. On the 21st of February 1921, Reza Khan staged a coup, leading 3,000 soldiers into Tehran and taking control of the capital. He did not depose the king, but let Ahmad Shah of the Qajar dynasty continue to sit on the throne, while he himself became army commander. In 1923, he became prime minister and seized real power. In 1925, Parliament deposed the Qajar dynasty and elected Reza Khan as the new king. On December 15, Reza Khan was crowned at Golestan Palace, establishing the Pahlavi dynasty. Tehran once again witnessed the change of dynasties. Reza Khan was a tough modernization promoter. Deeply influenced by Turkey's Kemalist reforms, he was determined to transform Persia from a backward agricultural country into a modern industrial nation. And Tehran would become the testing ground for this radical transformation. First was urban transformation. Reza Khan believed that old Tehran represented backwardness and conservatism and must be completely changed. In the 1930s, Tehran's old city walls were demolished. These walls, that had existed for 150 years, collapsed before bulldozers. They were replaced by wide, tree-lined boulevards. The most famous was Reza Avenue, 60 meters wide, running through the entire city from north to south. French plane trees were planted along the roads, and European-style buildings were constructed. Traditional mud brick houses were forcibly demolished, and residents were required to build modern buildings of stone or brick. Tehran's appearance changed rapidly. Narrow winding alleys became straight wide avenues. Low earthen houses became multi-story stone buildings. From the air, Tehran began to have the layout of a modern city. In 1934, Tehran University was established, Iran's first modern comprehensive university. Reza Khan personally attended the opening ceremony. The university established faculties of literature, law, medicine, engineering, and others, hiring European professors to teach. This marked the modernization of Iranian higher education. In 1938, the railway connecting Tehran and the Persian Gulf was completed and opened to traffic. This railway was 1,394 kilometers long, crossing rugged mountains and deserts, and was Iran's first railway. Reza Khan insisted on not borrowing from foreign countries and built it entirely with Iranian funds, which made him very proud. But Reza Khan's reforms were not only material, but also cultural. He tried to create a completely new Iranian identity, emphasizing the glorious history of the Persian Empire while downplaying Islamic influence. In 1935, He officially changed the country's name from Persia to Iran, meaning Land of the Aryans. This decision sparked controversy because the name Persia had been used for thousands of years. But Reza Khan believed that Iran better reflected the country's ancient history and national pride. More controversial was his clothing reform. In 1928, Reza Khan ordered all men to take off their traditional robes and turbans and wear Western suits and hats. He led by example, always appearing in public in crisp suits. Police patrolled Tehran streets, and when they saw people wearing traditional clothing, they would forcibly remove their robes and turbans. In 1936, Reza Khan went further, banning women from wearing veils. This caused a huge shock in conservative Iranian society. Many devout women, unwilling to remove their veils, chose to stay at home and no longer go out. But Reza Khan was unmoved. He believed the veil was a symbol of backwardness and must be abolished. These mandatory reforms sparked complex reactions in Tehran. For educated urban elites, this was progress and modernization, the necessary path for Iran to become strong. But for religious conservatives and traditional people, this was an insult to faith and tradition, a betrayal of Islamic values. Reza Khan's rule also became increasingly autocratic. He suppressed opposition, controlled the media, and established secret police. Any voice criticizing the government would be suppressed. Although parliament existed, it completely obeyed the king. In 1939, World War II broke out. Iran declared neutrality, but Reza Khan leaned toward Germany. This was not because he identified with Nazi ideology, but because Germany had no colonial history in Iran, unlike Britain and Russia, which threatened Iranian sovereignty. But this stance alarmed Britain and the Soviet Union. In August 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union, on the grounds that Iran might help Germany, invaded Iran from both north and south. Although the Iranian army had been built up by Reza Khan for many years, it collapsed with almost no resistance in the face of the combined attack of two superpowers. Britain and the Soviet Union occupied Tehran. They gave Reza Khan two choices: abdicate or be deposed. On September 16, Reza Khan announced his abdication and passed the throne to his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. A few days later, Reza Khan was exiled to Mauritius Island in South Africa. In 1944, he died there at the age of 66. Reza Khan ruled Iran for 16 years and profoundly changed Tehran and the entire country. He promoted modernization, built infrastructure, and strengthened centralization, but his methods were coercive and top-down, ignoring social traditions and people's feelings. This radical modernization planted the seeds of contradiction that would erupt decades later. Chapter 6: The Curse of Oil Nationalism and Coup. In 1941, when 22-year-old Mohammad Reza Pahlavi inherited the throne, Tehran was occupied by foreign troops. British troops controlled the south, Soviet troops controlled the north, and American troops also gradually entered, using Iran as a corridor for transporting supplies to the Soviet Union. The young king had almost no real power and was just a puppet. During World War II, Tehran became a logistics base for the Allies. Foreign troops, diplomats, and merchants filled the city. Iranian oil was used to support the Allied war machine, but the Iranian people lived in poverty and hunger, food shortages, soaring prices, and rampant black markets. After the war, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw its troops and even supported two puppet regimes in northwestern Iran, the Azerbaijan People's Government and the Republic of Kurdistan. Iran faced the danger of division. Under American pressure, the Soviet Union finally withdrew in 1946. But this crisis made Iranians deeply aware that their country was still a pawn in the great power game. Post-war Tehran was politically active. After the end of Reza Khan's autocratic rule, various political forces emerged. The Communist Tudeh Party had great influence among workers and intellectuals. The Nationalist National Front attracted the middle class. Religious conservatives also began to organize. Parliament became active again, and newspapers and political parties sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Among these political forces, the most influential were the nationalists, whose leader was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh came from nobility, born in Tehran in 1882. He had studied in France and Switzerland and obtained a doctorate in law. He was a charismatic orator, a staunch nationalist, and a believer in parliamentary democracy. His core proposition was simple: Iran's oil should belong to Iranians. At that time, Iran's oil industry was completely controlled by Britain. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company monopolized Iran's oil extraction, refining, and export. The Iranian government could only receive meager concession fees, 16% of oil profits, while the British company received 84%. What angered Iranians even more was that the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company enjoyed extraterritorial rights in Iran, and the Iranian government had no right to supervise its accounts and operations. Mossadegh constantly called for oil nationalization in parliament. His speeches were full of passion and moved countless Iranians. In March 1951, Parliament voted to pass the oil nationalization bill. In April, Mossadegh was appointed prime minister. On May 1, he officially announced the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This news sparked frenzied celebrations in Tehran. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, shouting, "Iran's oil belongs to Iranians." Mossadegh became a national hero, and his photos appeared in every corner of Tehran. But Britain would not accept this result. British Prime Minister Churchill called Mossadegh a fanatic and demanded the return of the oil company. When Iran refused, Britain imposed a comprehensive economic blockade on Iran, banning the purchase of Iranian oil, freezing Iranian assets in Britain, and preventing other countries from trading oil with Iran. Iran's oil exports almost completely stopped. Oil revenue accounted for a large part of the Iranian government's income, and losing this income, the economy quickly fell into trouble. Unemployment rose, inflation intensified, and government finances were stretched thin. Meanwhile, Mossadegh's relationship with the young king Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became increasingly tense. Mossadegh tried to limit the king's power and transform Iran into a parliamentary system where the king was only a symbolic head of state. But the king was unwilling to give up power. He believed Mossadegh threatened the royal family's position. Britain and the United States decided to take action. The United States initially had sympathy for Mossadegh, considering him a Democrat. But as the Cold War intensified, the United States worried that if Mossadegh's government collapsed, the Communist Tudeh Party might come to power and Iran would fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. So the United States decided to support Britain's plan to overthrow Mossadegh. In 1953, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and British MI6 planned a coup, codenamed Operation Ajax. The CIA sent agent Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, to Tehran to coordinate operation. On August 15, the king signed an order dismissing Mossadegh as prime minister and appointing General Zahedi as the new prime minister. But Mossadegh refused to accept, and his supporters clashed with royalists in Tehran's streets. The situation was unfavorable for the king, and he was forced to flee to Iraq for refuge. But in the following days, the situation reversed. The CIA mobilized Tehran's gang leaders, gave them large amounts of cash, and had them organize spontaneous royalist demonstrations. Royalist officers in the army received support and encouragement. Some bribed civilians also joined in. On August 19, royalist troops occupied government buildings and arrested Mossadegh. The king returned to Tehran from Iraq and was welcomed by royalists. The coup succeeded. Mossadegh was sentenced to 3 years in prison and then placed under house arrest until his death in 1967. His national front was banned, and supporters were arrested or exiled. The 1953 coup was a turning point in modern Iranian history. It ended Iran's brief democratic experiment and strengthened monarchical autocracy. More importantly, it left a deep wound in the hearts of Iranians. Their democratically elected government was overthrown by foreign powers, and their national hero was imprisoned. This humiliation and anger would erupt in the revolution 25 years later. After the coup, the king became Iran's absolute ruler. He established a close alliance with the United States, and Iran became an important pillar of the United States in the Middle East. In 1954, Iran reached a new agreement with Western oil companies, forming an international consortium to jointly develop Iranian oil. Although oil nominally belonged to Iran, actual control remained in the hands of Western companies. Tehran once again became a stage for foreign powers. American advisors filled government departments, and American companies received numerous contracts. For many Iranians, this was not independence, but a new colonialism. Chapter 7. The Illusion of Prosperity. White Revolution and the Pahlavi Era. In the 1960s, Tehran entered a contradictory era, prosperous on the surface, but crisis-ridden underneath. In 1963, King Mohammad Reza Pahlavi launched the White Revolution, a series of top-down reforms. White meant bloodless revolution, as opposed to red communist revolution. The main contents of the White Revolution included land reform, distributing large landowners' land to farmers, granting women suffrage, nationalizing forests and pastures, worker profit-sharing plans, literacy campaigns, establishing health corps to provide medical services to rural areas. The king hoped that through these reforms, he could ease social contradictions, weaken the power of landlords and the religious class, and consolidate his rule. In January 1963, he held a referendum, and the White Revolution received overwhelming support. But these reforms triggered strong opposition from religious conservatives. In June 1963, a religious scholar named Ruhollah Khomeini delivered a speech in Qom, fiercely attacking the king's reforms. He accused the king of betraying Islam and selling out Iran to the United States and Israel. Khomeini was arrested, triggering large-scale protests. The army opened fire, causing hundreds of deaths. In 1964, Khomeini was exiled, first to Turkey, then Iraq, and finally to France in 1978. But his influence did not disappear. He continued to spread his ideas to the Iranian people through audio tapes and books. Meanwhile, the surging oil revenues brought huge wealth to Iran. In the 1960s, oil prices rose steadily. After the 1973 oil crisis, oil prices soared from $3 per barrel to $12. Iran's oil revenue increased from $1 billion in 1970 to $20 billion in 1974. The king used this wealth to build Tehran into a modern metropolis. Skyscrapers rose from the ground. Tehran's skyline was changed by high-rises. The most famous was the Borji Milad Tower, 54 stories high, the tallest building in the Middle East at the time. Wide highways crisscrossed, connecting all corners of the city. In the 1970s, Tehran's metro began planning and construction. Tehran became the cultural and entertainment center of the Middle East. There were the most fashionable cafes, the most luxurious hotels, and the most advanced cinemas. Western popular culture flooded into Tehran rock music, miniskirts, Hollywood movies. Tehran's nightlife was rich and colorful, with dance halls, bars, and nightclubs doing brisk business. In 1971, the king held a grand celebration at Persepolis to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire. Heads of state and royal family members from around the world gathered in Iran. The celebration cost hundreds of millions of dollars, showcasing Iran's wealth and the king's ambitions. French chefs were invited to prepare the banquet. Champagne was airlifted from France, and tents were made with the most luxurious materials. In the 1970s, Tehran was called the Paris of the Middle East by Western media. Western tourists came in droves, and the Iranian elite lived luxurious lives. In the wealthy northern districts of Tehran, luxury villas lined up, luxury cars were everywhere, and private swimming pools were ubiquitous. But this prosperity belonged only to a few. Tehran's social divide grew wider. The north was a paradise for the rich, the south a hell for the poor. Millions of migrants who flooded into Tehran from rural areas lived in crowded slums, without basic public services, without stable jobs, and without hope. Although the White Revolution's land reform distributed land, it did not provide supporting support, no credit, no technical guidance, no market channels. Many farmers could not make a living and were forced to leave the land and flood into Tehran looking for work. But the city could not absorb so much labor, and unemployment remained high. More serious was political oppression. The king established a powerful secret police agency, SAVAK. SAVAK with the help of the US CIA and Israeli Mossad, monitored, arrested, and tortured any opposition. Thousands were imprisoned, and many were executed. Although Tehran's universities prospered, student political activities were closely monitored. Cultural westernization also triggered strong opposition from religious conservatives. In their view, Tehran had become a city of sin, filled with alcohol, gambling, and pornography, deviating from Islamic teachings. By the late 1970s, the contradictions in Iranian society had accumulated to a critical point. Wealth gap, political corruption, cultural westernization, and the terror of secret police. These problems continued to ferment under the glossy exterior of oil wealth. In 1977, U.S. President Carter visited Tehran and praised Iran at a New Year's dinner as an island of stability. But just 1 year later, this island of stability was submerged by the tide of revolution. The volcano was about to erupt, and Tehran would once again become the center of history. Chapter 8: Revolutionary Fire, Overthrowing the Monarchy. On the 7th of January 1978, an article was published in a government-controlled newspaper, slandering the exiled religious leader Khomeini, calling him a British agent. This article ignited the fuse of revolution. The next day, religious students in Qom took to the streets to protest. Police opened fire, causing several deaths. According to Shia tradition, funerals for the dead are held 40 days later. On February 18, funerals held in multiple cities turned into demonstrations, and more people died. 40 days later, more funerals, more demonstrations, more deaths. Thus, every 40 days, there was a protest and conflict, forming an escalating cycle. Each suppression created new martyrs, and each martyr sparked more anger. By the fall of 1978, protests had spread to Tehran. Initially, only religious students and bazaar merchants, but soon workers, intellectuals, and the middle class also joined. Different groups had different demands. Some demanded democratic reform, some demanded social justice, some demanded the establishment of an Islamic government. But they had one common goal: the king must step down. On September 8th, Friday, tens of thousands demonstrated in Tehran's streets. The night before, the king had declared martial law, banning assemblies, but demonstrators ignored the ban. At 10:30 a.m., at Jaleh Square, the army opened fire on the crowd. Gunfire continued for several hours. The exact death toll remains unclear to this day. The government said 87. The opposition said thousands. This day was called Black Friday and became a turning point in the revolution. The suppression did not deter protesters, but sparked even greater anger. In October and November, Tehran fell into chaos. A wave of strikes swept the country. Oil workers struck, bank employees struck, government officials struck, even national television employees struck. Tehran's economy was paralyzed. Gas stations had no gasoline, stores had no goods, banks were closed, and power supply was unstable. Street protests occurred almost daily. People held up photos of Khomeini, shouting "Down with the Shah" and "Long live Islam." Although Khomeini was far away in Paris, his audio tapes were widely circulated in Tehran. His voice was transmitted to Iran via telephone lines, recorded, and then played in mosques, bazaars, and family gatherings. The king tried to save the situation through concessions. He dismissed the head of Savak, released some political prisoners, appointed moderates to form a new government, and promised reforms. But it was too late. People no longer believed him. In December, the Shia holy month of Ashura arrived. Ashura commemorates the martyrdom of Hussein, grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. For Shia Muslims, this is a symbol of resisting tyranny and sacrificing for justice. On December 10 and 11, millions flooded Tehran's streets. This was the largest demonstration in Iranian history. People wore white shrouds, indicating their willingness to sacrifice for the revolution. But this time, the army did not shoot. Soldiers also began to sympathize with protesters, and some even joined the demonstrations. The king realized he had lost control. On the 16th of January, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi boarded a plane at Tehran airport, nominally going abroad for rest, but everyone knew he would never return. After the king left, Tehran erupted in celebration. People flooded the streets, toppling the king's statues and burning royal portraits. Reza Avenue was renamed Revolution Avenue, and Pahlavi Square was renamed Freedom Square. But the revolution was not over. Although the king had left, the government he appointed remained. The military high command was still loyal to the royal family. The situation remained unstable. 2 weeks later, on the 1st of February, 1979, Khomeini returned to Tehran from Paris. When the Air France charter he was on landed at Mehrabad Airport, millions were waiting there. From the airport to the city center, the roads were packed with people crying, cheering, and praying. Khomeini delivered a speech at Behesht Zahra Cemetery, where revolutionary martyrs were buried. He declared the government appointed by the king illegal and said he would appoint his own government. He called on the army to join the people and not serve the old regime. On February 11, the Revolutionary Guards and pro-revolution military personnel occupied army headquarters, television stations, and government buildings. The prime minister appointed by the king announced his resignation. The Iranian Islamic Revolution succeeded. Tehran once again witnessed a historic moment. 2,500 years of monarchy ended, and a new era began. Chapter 9. Post-Revolution, Tehran, War and Rebirth. Post-revolution, Tehran underwent dramatic changes. Symbols of the old regime were destroyed. The king's statues were toppled. Streets were renamed, and Pahlavi-era symbols were erased. Revolutionary courts were established to try officials of the old regime. Hundreds were executed, including former prime ministers, generals, and Savak leaders. These trials were often hasty and lacked due process, but in the revolutionary fervor, few questioned them. On the 4th of November 1979, a group calling themselves Students Following the Imam's Line occupied the U.S. Embassy and took 52 American diplomats and staff hostage. The students demanded that the United States extradite the exiled Shah for trial. This hostage crisis lasted 444 days and completely broke Iran's relations with the West. The United States imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iran and froze Iranian assets in the United States. In April 1980, the United States attempted a military rescue, but the operation failed when helicopters crashed in the desert. The hostage crisis reinforced the revolutionary regime's anti-American stance. In Tehran, the walls of the U.S. Embassy were painted with anti-American slogans and called the Den of Espionage. This building still maintains its 1,979 appearance and has become a symbol of the revolution. After the revolution, Iran established a unique political system, the Islamic Republic. Nominally a republic, with a president and parliament elected through elections. But supreme power belongs to the supreme leader, held by a religious scholar, responsible for overseeing all government institutions. Khomeini became the first supreme leader. Tehran underwent profound Islamization. Women must wear headscarves, and violators are punished by morality police. Alcohol is banned. Bars and nightclubs are closed. Western music and movies are banned. Men and women must be separated in public places, including on buses and in university classrooms. This city, once called the Paris of the Middle East, became a symbol of the Islamic Republic. But beneath the strict exterior, Tehran's life remained vibrant. People found their own ways holding private parties at home, listening to band music in basements, watching foreign television through satellite dishes. On the 22nd of September 1980, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, taking advantage of Iran's post-revolutionary chaos, launched an invasion. He thought the Iranian army had collapsed and could easily win, but he was wrong. The Iran-Iraq War broke out, and this war would last 8 years, becoming one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Although Tehran was far from the front lines, the shadow of war hung over the city. Starting in 1985, Iraqi Scud missiles occasionally struck Tehran, causing civilian casualties. The missiles had no precision guidance and randomly fell on residential areas, schools, and markets. When the sirens sounded, people hid in basements, praying the missiles wouldn't fall near their homes. The entire city entered a wartime state. Blackouts were implemented at night, and windows were taped to prevent glass from shattering. Food and fuel were rationed, and people queued for bread, sugar, and cooking oil. Black markets were rampant, and prices soared. Young people were mobilized to the front. Tehran's streets were filled with teenagers in military uniforms, some only 14 or 15 years old. They were told that fighting for Islam was the highest honor, and martyrs would go directly to heaven. Tens of thousands of Tehran's young people died on the battlefield. Tehran's walls were painted with portraits of martyrs, young faces full of idealism. Each neighborhood had its own martyrs, and their families were honored as martyr families and enjoyed special status. The war shaped the collective memory of the post-revolutionary generation of Iranians. It strengthened the legitimacy of the Islamic regime. The government claimed Iran was resisting external aggression and Western conspiracies, defending the Islamic Revolution. It also cultivated a spirit of self-reliance. Under international isolation and economic sanctions, Iran had to rely on itself. On the 3rd of July, 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 was shot down by a U.S. warship, killing all 290 passengers and crew, many of whom were Tehran residents. This incident sparked enormous grief and anger in Tehran. A month later, Khomeini accepted the UN ceasefire resolution. He said accepting the ceasefire was more bitter than drinking poison, but for Iran's interests, he had no choice. On August 20, the Iran-Iraq War officially ended. The war had no winners. Iran lost nearly 500,000 people. The economy was devastated, and infrastructure was destroyed. But the Iranian people also showed amazing resilience, persisting under the most difficult conditions. On the 3rd of June, 1989, Khomeini died at the age of 86. His funeral was held in Tehran, attended by millions. The crowd was so dense that his body fell out of the coffin several times. Khomeini was buried in a mausoleum in southern Tehran, which later became a pilgrimage site. Khomeini's death marked the end of the revolution's first phase. Iran and Tehran would enter a new era. Chapter 10. Contemporary Tehran, the tug-of-war between reform and conservatism. After Khomeini's death, Ali Khamenei became the new supreme leader. Iran entered a new phase. The passion of revolution gradually subsided, and practical problems emerged. In the 1990s, Iran began post-war reconstruction. Tehran's population surged from 5 million to over 10 million. New residential areas sprang up on the city's periphery, and commercial centers constantly emerged. But economic sanctions and international isolation made the reconstruction process slow and difficult. In 1997, reformist candidate Mohammad Khatami was elected president. He was a moderate religious scholar who promised to promote political reform, cultural openness, and dialogue with the West. His slogan was, "Dialogue of Civilizations," not "Clash of Civilizations." Tehran's youth placed great hopes in him, believing Iran would usher in change. During the Khatami era, Tehran experienced a brief cultural flourishing. Newspapers and magazines became freer, daring to discuss sensitive topics. Films and literary works explored social issues. Cafes became places for young people to discuss politics and philosophy. Women wore headscarves more loosely and dressed more fashionably. A new atmosphere appeared on Tehran's streets, open and full of hope. This was the most open period in post-revolutionary Tehran. People believed that reform was possible, that Iran could achieve democracy and freedom while maintaining its Islamic character. But reform soon faced conservative backlash. Conservatives controlled the judiciary, the Revolutionary Guards, and religious foundations. They believed reform threatened the revolution's achievements. Reformist newspapers were closed, journalists were arrested, and reformist politicians were marginalized. Although Khatami was president, his power was limited, and he could not counter conservative obstruction. In 2005, conservative candidate Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president. He was a populist from humble origins who promised to help the poor and confront the West. During his tenure, Iran's nuclear program became an international focus, and the West imposed stricter sanctions on Iran. In June 2009, Iran held presidential elections. Reformist candidate Mousavi challenged Ahmadinejad. On election night, officials announced that Ahmadinejad had won by an overwhelming margin, but many suspected election fraud. The next day, millions flooded Tehran's streets, demanding a recount. This movement was called the Green Movement because Mousavi's campaign color was green. Protesters wore green clothing and marched through Tehran's streets, shouting, "Where is my vote?" Social media became a tool for organizing and spreading. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube were filled with videos and photos from Tehran's streets. The whole world was watching. But the government carried out brutal suppression. Riot police and militias beat protesters. Thousands were arrested and dozens were killed. On June 20, a 26-year-old woman named Neda Aga Sultan was shot dead during a protest. A video of her being shot, falling, and bleeding to death was uploaded online and spread around the world. Neda became a symbol of the Green Movement. By the end of 2009, the Green Movement was suppressed. Mousavi and another reformist leader, Karoubi, were placed under house arrest and remain unfree to this day. But the Green Movement revealed Iran's deep social divide. Some supported the status quo of the Islamic Republic. Others demanded fundamental change. In 2013, moderate candidate Hassan Rouhani was elected president. He was a pragmatic politician who promised to improve the economy and relations with the West. His core policy was to resolve the nuclear issue and seek the lifting of sanctions. After years of negotiations, on the 14th of July, 2015, Iran and 6 world powers, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia, signed the nuclear agreement in Vienna. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program and accept international supervision in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. This news sparked celebrations in Tehran. People flooded the streets, cheering, cars honking, strangers hugging each other. Many believed Iran would reintegrate into the international community, the economy would improve, and young people would have a better future. Tehran in 2015 was a city full of contradictions. It was both the political center of the Islamic Republic and a bastion of secular culture. It retained Persian traditions while embracing globalization. It had strict religious regulations, yet an active underground culture. Tehran's youth, the majority of the population, were well educated, aware of the outside world, and eager for change. They started businesses in cafes, expressed opinions on social media, and released passion at underground concerts. In their own way, they were shaping Tehran's future. Chapter 11. Hope and Disappointment. The Collapse of the Nuclear Deal and Resistance. On the 14th of July 2015, when news of the Vienna nuclear agreement reached Tehran, the entire city was immersed in celebration. People believed sanctions would be lifted, the economy would recover, and Iran would reintegrate into the international community. However, over the next 10 years, Tehran experienced repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. In January 2016, international sanctions were officially lifted. Tehran's businessmen began negotiating cooperation with European companies. Airlines ordered new aircraft, and foreign tourists began to increase. President Rouhani's approval rating reached its peak. In May 2017, he was easily re-elected with 57% of the vote, and Tehran's reformists and youth saw hope for continued opening. But hope quickly shattered. In December 2017, economic protests starting from the northeastern city of Mashhad quickly spread to Tehran and nationwide. Protesters initially complained about rising prices and unemployment, but it quickly evolved into dissatisfaction with the entire political system. On Tehran's streets, protesters shouted, "Death to the dictator," and even, "Not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran," a criticism of the government's heavy investment of resources in the region. The regime quickly suppressed the protests, but social discontent was already clear. On the 8th of May 2018, U.S. President Trump announced withdrawal from the nuclear agreement and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. This decision was catastrophic for Tehran. The Iranian rial began to plummet. In early 2018, $1 exchanged for about 40,000 rials. By year's end, the black market rate reached $1 for 140,000 rials. Tehran's currency exchangers closed, and people queued to buy dollars and gold to preserve value. The middle class watched helplessly as their savings evaporated. Sanctions cut Iran off from the international financial system. European companies withdrew en masse. Boeing and Airbus canceled aircraft orders, and foreign investment disappeared. Tehran's unemployment rate soared, especially youth unemployment exceeding 25%. The inflation rate reached over 40%, and ordinary people's lives became increasingly difficult. In November 2019, the government suddenly announced a 50% increase in gasoline prices. This became the last straw that broke the camel's back. On November 15, protests erupted nationwide. Tehran's streets saw intense clashes, with protesters burning banks and government buildings and blocking roads. The regime's response was brutal, cutting off the internet and deploying Revolutionary Guards and Basij militia. According to international human rights organizations, over 1,500 people were killed and thousands arrested in just a few days of suppression. This was the bloodiest crackdown since the 1979 revolution. Tehran fell into terror. The internet was cut for nearly a week, and the outside world couldn't know what was happening in the city. When the network was restored, people shared information about missing relatives on social media, searching for the whereabouts of those arrested. In January 2020, Tehran experienced a dramatic week. In the early hours of January 3, Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani was killed by a U.S. drone at Baghdad airport. Soleimani was considered a national hero in Iran, and news of his death shocked the entire country. On January 6th, millions attended his funeral in Tehran, a scene as grand as Khomeini's funeral in 1989. The crowd chanted, "Death to America," and demanded revenge. In the early hours of January 8, Iran fired more than a dozen missiles at U.S. military bases in Iraq. Tehran residents were awakened before dawn by the sound of missile launches, and many worried that war was about to break out. Fortunately, the United States did not retaliate further, and tensions temporarily eased. But on the same morning, a Ukraine International Airlines passenger plane crashed shortly after taking off from Tehran's Imam Khomeini International Airport, killing all 176 people on board, many of whom were Iranian Canadians. Initially, the Iranian government denied responsibility, claiming it was a technical malfunction. But, under international pressure and conclusive evidence, 3 days later, the Revolutionary Guards admitted it was human error in a highly tense situation. The air defense system mistakenly identified the passenger plane as an enemy missile and shot it down. This admission sparked new protests in Tehran. On January 11, thousands of students and citizens marched through Tehran streets, shouting, "Khamenei resign, and our enemy is not America. It's right here." Protesters' anger was directed not only at this tragedy, but at the government's lies and incompetence. In June 2021, hardline figure Ebrahim Raisi was elected president. Raisi had been judiciary chief and was accused of participating in the 1988 mass execution of political prisoners. His election marked conservatives' complete control, but this election's turnout was only 48.8%, a historic low for the Islamic Republic. Many Tehranis expressed their disappointment by not voting. The Raisi government adopted more hardline domestic and foreign policies. Domestically, suppression of dissidents intensified. Internationally, nuclear negotiations reached an impasse. Tehran's economy continued to deteriorate. The rial continued to depreciate, and the inflation rate exceeded 50%. In September 2022, something happened in Tehran that changed everything. On September 13, two-year-old Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini was visiting Tehran with her family. She was stopped by morality police near a metro station for improper hijab wearing. She was taken to the morality police detention center. On September 16, Mahsa Amini died in the hospital. Officials said she had a sudden heart attack, but witnesses and her family said she was beaten in the detention center. Mahsa's death ignited the anger that had accumulated in Iranian society for a long time. On September 17, protests started from her hometown of Kurdistan, and quickly spread to Tehran and nationwide. This protest was different from previous ones. It was led by women, with the slogan, Woman, Life, Freedom, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. Unprecedented scenes appeared on Tehran's streets. Young women removed their headscarves in public, burned headscarves, and cut their hair. They faced armed police, shouting, "We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are all together." Male protesters stood shoulder to shoulder with them. This was not just opposition to mandatory hijab, but a challenge to the entire political system. Protesters shouted, "Down with the dictator," demanding the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. The regime's suppression was brutal. Revolutionary Guards and Basij militia shot at protesters, using live ammunition, rubber bullets, and tear gas. According to human rights organizations, over 500 people were killed during months of protests, including dozens of children. Over 20,000 were arrested. In December, the regime began executing arrested protesters. The first to be executed was 3-year-old Mohsen Shekari, charged with enmity against God. His execution sparked international condemnation, but the regime continued to execute more people. By early 2023, large-scale protests were suppressed, but their impact was profound. On Tehran streets, many women continued not to wear headscarves or wore them loosely, and morality police enforcement significantly decreased. Although the Woman, Life, Freedom movement was suppressed, it broke the barrier of fear and demonstrated Iranian society's, especially the younger generation's, desire for change. On the 19th of May, 2024, Iran experienced a shocking event. President Raisi and Foreign Minister Abdullahian died when their helicopter crashed in the northwestern mountains, killing everyone on board. The cause of Raisi's death remains unclear to this day. Was it an accident or assassination? But it created a political vacuum. In June, in a special election, reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian unexpectedly won. This cardiac surgeon promised to promote moderate policies, improve relations with the West, and ease social tensions. But Pezeshkian faces enormous challenges. Economic crisis, international sanctions, social division, regional conflicts, all these problems have no simple solutions. Moreover, in Iran's political system, real power rests with Supreme Leader Khamenei, who is already 85 years old. In October 2024, Israel conducted airstrikes on Iranian military facilities, hitting targets near Tehran. This was the first time Israel publicly acknowledged attacks on Iranian soil. Iran and Israel's shadow war became open confrontation, and Tehran residents once again lived under the shadow of war. Today's Tehran, standing at the threshold of 2026, is full of uncertainty. The economy is still struggling, society is still divided, and the region is still turbulent. But Tehranis have shown amazing resilience. Through all the difficulties, they continue to live, work, love, create, and fight for a better future. Conclusion. From a refuge under Mongol iron hooves in the 13th century to a modern metropolis of 9 million people in the 21st century, Tehran has traveled a long and winding road. It has experienced a change of dynasties, from Qajar to Pahlavi, from monarchy to Islamic Republic. It witnessed revolutionary fires, the constitutional revolution of 1906, the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the Green Movement of 2009. It endured the trauma of war, the 8-year catastrophe of the Iran-Iraq War, the fear of missile attacks, the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of young people. It survived the pressure of sanctions, economic isolation, currency devaluation, but never surrendered. Tehran is a city of contradictions, tradition and modernity, faith and secularism, repression and freedom coexist. These contradictions have shaped its unique character. It is not perfect, but it is real. It is not simple, but it is rich. The 2015 nuclear agreement brought new hope to Tehran and Iran. But history tells us that hope is often accompanied by challenges, and change is often full of twists and turns. What will Tehran's future be like? No one knows. But one thing is certain, this city and its people have proven their resilience. They survive in adversity. resist under oppression, and seek hope in despair. Whatever the future holds, Tehran will continue to write its own history, because Tehran is not just a city, it is a spirit that never gives up beneath the mountains in the long river of history. Thank you for listening. Tehran's story continues, and we are all witnesses to this story.